In this video, we're going to talk about mental illness and its etiology, or its origins. A few quick related terms to know. Phenomenology is the description of a disorder or its associated symptoms. And when we talk about treatment, we're talking about biochemical or psychosocial interventions. Biochemical interventions would be drugs, or biomedical interventions would be shock therapy, for example. Psychosocial interventions would be therapy. So when we talk about etiology, we mean the origin or the underlying mechanism of the mental illness. And so in this video, we're going to talk about two different models that can describe the etiology of a mental illness. These are the diathesis stress model and then also the biopsychosocial model. We're going to be using anxiety as an example to work through these models to apply them. And so when we talk about anxiety, we're talking about a future-oriented mood state, so forward thinking, that's characterized by apprehension because one feels out of control or cannot predict upcoming events. Remember back to when we talked about arousal theory and we have this curve of performance versus anxiety level. There's some optimal level of anxiety where performance or behavior is maximized, but with too little or too much anxiety, we see performance drop off. If we have two college students, college student A and college student B, and they both have stressors in their life, they have anxiety, why does one, in this case college student A, develop an anxiety disorder, but college student B does not develop a disorder, even though they're in the same environment? So the diathesis stress model is one way we can explain why a disorder will emerge in some individuals, but not in others. And this model says that we inherent tendencies to express some behavior or trait, perhaps some maladaptive anxiety manifestation, that may be activated under stress. So let's break down these words here. Diathesis means the tendency to, and this is going to be due to genetic factors, and stress are going to be due to environmental factors. So this model basically combines genetic factors and environmental factors. So we can use glasses as an analogy to describe this model. And so if these glasses are filled up to this line, then we have what we would consider to be an anxiety disorder. With college student A, we have some genetic vulnerability, and I'm filling that in here in pink. So this is the diathesis. That fills the glass towards this threshold for what would we consider to be an anxiety disorder. And then on top of that, we add the environmental factors, the stress in the environment that would lead to this disorder. And here we see that these two combined factors exceed this line that we classify anxiety disorder at. And so this person we would say develops an anxiety disorder. Whereas person B has a much lower genetic vulnerability, and here this pink area fills up less of the glass. And we might have the same stressors, so the same amount of yellow, but we don't quite reach the anxiety disorder threshold, and so this person, we would say, does not develop an anxiety disorder. So we're talking about genetic factors and environmental factors, and here we've talked about them independently, but they actually do interact. So let's look a little at this interaction. So if we draw out a graph with outcome on the y-axis, so this is negative to positive, this is sort of mental health outcome, we could say, and environment on the x-axis from negative environment to positive environment. We can have an individual with this blue line who, no matter what the environment is, has the same outcome. We would call this person resilient. They're resilient to changes in the environment, their outcome is stable. Whereas this red line, when this person is in a negative environment, they have a negative outcome. And we would say that this person is vulnerable to negative environments, and that has a negative consequence on their outcome, whether that's their mental health outcome or behavior outcome. So these two lines represent two different individuals and how they respond to environmental changes, which is going to be determined by genetic factors. And so we say that these two individuals have different vulnerability to environmental stressors. Now, if we draw this orange line, this individual we call malleable. They have negative outcomes in negative environments, but they have positive outcomes in positive environments. So this individual has a much higher reactivity. They respond to the environment with more sensitivity. Compared to the baseline individual who is resilient, we call this person also non-malleable. So if we look at these three different individuals, we see that they would all have different genotypes. Even though they have the same environmental stressors, those genotypes are going to respond to environmental variation in different ways. So this is the diathesis stress model. This is one way that psychologists have framed how a mental illness emerges. A second model that's used to describe the etiology of mental illness is the biopsychosocial model. This model looks at the combined contributions of various factors to one's mental health, including biological factors, developmental, behavioral, cognitive, and social factors. So let's draw this out as a Venn diagram. So we can draw a circle that would contain our biological factors. We can contain a circle that contains our psychological factors, which is going to capture our developmental, behavioral, and cognitive ones. And then we have a social context circle that's going to capture our social factors related to mental health. All three of these areas unite to determine one's mental health. And so in our biology realm, we could talk about different biological factors that contribute to mental health, including gender, physical illness, disability, genetic vulnerability, which we just saw an example of, immune function, neurochemistry, stress reactivity, all sorts of biological factors that might lead to differential susceptibility and emergence of mental health disorders. In the psychology realm, we can look at learning and memory processes, attitudes and beliefs, differences in personality, behaviors, emotions, coping skills, and past trauma. In our social context realm, we can look at social supports, family background, cultural traditions, educational background, and socioeconomic status. So we can look at all of these factors to get an understanding of the etiology of a mental illness. So if we want to characterize an anxiety disorder with this model, we can step through each category and see what the factors are that might contribute to an anxiety disorder. So for biological factors with an anxiety disorder, we often see hyperactivation, so increased activation of different parts of the nervous system. So we see hyperactivation of our HPA axis. This is our hypothalamic pituitary adrenal gland axis. And this is a connection between our nervous system and our endocrine system. Basically, it drives our hormone reflexes and our stress responses. So when the nervous system gets activated, we'll see a release of stress hormones, which is going to lead to a stress response in the body. We also see a hyperactivation of our sympathetic nervous system. This is part of our autonomic nervous system, again, responsible for our fight or flight response. So this is part of what leads to anxiety symptoms. And then we often see hyperactivation of the limbic system. And this is the part of the brain that's going to be mediating emotions and memories and driving lower order emotional processing in the midbrain. Another biological factor is we often see hypoactivation, and this is reduced activation of GABA neurotransmission. GABA, again, is our primary inhibitory neurotransmitter in the brain. So if we reduced activity associated with GABA, we have less inhibition, which is going to mean that we have increased overall brain activity. So we have hypoactivation of GABA transmission. Reduced GABA leads to anxiety arousal in the brain. We can look at our psychological factors that contribute to an anxiety disorder, and here I'll write these out in green. And first, our developmental factors. We see increased susceptibility to anxiety disorders during critical windows of development in childhood and during adolescence. We also see a positive correlation between anxiety symptoms in adolescence and anxiety symptoms in adulthood. If we see an adolescent with an anxiety symptoms, they're more likely to develop an anxiety disorder in adulthood. In terms of behavioral factors, we can talk about learned responses that might lead to these anxiety manifestations. And these could cover classical conditioning, operant conditioning, and social learning or modeling, all the types of learning that we talked about earlier in this course. When it comes to cognitive factors, we can look at how one labels different cues, both environmental cues and internal cues. We can also try to explore maladaptive thought processes that might contribute to the anxiety. Often individuals with an anxiety disorder are going to feel a sense of uncontrollability. So those were our psychological factors. Now we'll talk about our social factors. When it comes to social context, we're looking at environmental factors. So we can look at stress and stressors. So stressful life events are going to trigger biological vulnerabilities to anxiety, and most of the stressful events that we encounter as humans are social in nature. Another thing to look at when it comes to social factors is minority status and discrimination and stressors associated with being a minority. So one psychologist, Mayer, proposed the minority stress model, and they show that LGB individuals have an increased prevalence for anxiety disorders. They explained this in several ways and tied this to their sexual identity. This increase in anxiety was likely due to an increase in stress that's associated with stigma, prejudice, and discrimination associated with their sexual identity. So here we see the different factors, the biological, the psychological, and the social factors that all combine and contribute to the emergence of a mental illness, in this case an anxiety disorder. In this video, we've talked about 2 attempts to explain what leads to the emergence of a mental disorder. There are other models that try to explain this process. In class, we'll get practice applying these models that we just learned about to different disorders.